Nature wants us to be fat. That is a belief held so strongly by Richard J. Johnson, MD, that he wrote a book with that exact title. On top of being a professor in medicine at the University of Colorado, who is board certified in internal medicine, infectious diseases, and kidney disease, he has led 20 years of research on the cause of obesity and diabetes, with a keen interest in the roles of sugar, fructose, and uric acid. His previous books are titled The Sugar Fix and The Fat Switch, with his newest being called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat: The Surprising Science Behind Why We Gain Weight and How We Can Prevent and Reverse It. Rick, thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
Fantastic. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you. So what was your goal with this book?
Well, the goal of this book is really to bring to the public the great science that has been developed, that has come out on this topic of what's causing obesity, and the insights that the new science has as it might lead to different approaches to lose weight and to keep it off. It's all based on science that really crosses from studies in mice and laboratory animals to people, but also studies of animals in nature, studies of anthropology and evolution and biology. So it's really kind of a multi-pronged attack at trying to figure out what's causing obesity. And I've been involved in this so long that I thought it would be of value for people to know about. That, for example, that obesity is actually a really positive thing for animals in the wild, because it can be really important for survival, and how we developed processes to really help put on weight because of this history that we have of there being times when survival was critical, and being able to store fat was like really necessary for us to make it. And so that's what kind of led me to writing the book.
And we will certainly get to what led to the need to be able to store more fat for the sake of survival here in a second. But I feel like asking why nature wants to be fat at times is such a simple, maybe obvious, but still a brilliant starting point, because animals do gain fat for the sake of survival, for hibernation, and then also migration too, which does beg a question that you also answer, which is, why is being overweight to fat beneficial for humans in modern times? So why is it?
So it turns out that the critical thing for all animals in nature is to be able to survive, and fat can provide calories when there's no food around. Scientists have spent years trying to figure out, what's the biologic response to starvation? Yeah, what's the biologic response to dehydration? What's the biological response to when a predator is chasing you? And we've learned all these things. This was like the basic biology 101, where you learn about all these different processes about what happens when things are really bad. But animals in the wild, they don't want to be in those bad situations. So what they want to do is they would prefer to be prepared, so that when there is no food, they have fat stores so that they don't go through starvation. And when they can find water, even if there's no water around, they can make water, and so avoid dehydration. And so there are all these, it's clear that animals would like to, it would be smart if there was a way to prepare for a biologic crisis, as opposed to wait for it to happen. And what, the great discovery was that there is a biologic switch that animals use to protect them before the crisis occurs. And this is, for me, was kind of the golden moment to realize that this is really what animals do, and that it's an actual switch that they trigger. Normally, animals will maintain their weight, really, tight. They'll if they eat too much one day, they'll eat less the next. If they burn too much energy one day, they'll rest the next. They try to maintain their fat at a certain level that's, provides a little bit of buffer if there's no food around, but, it's not anything particularly large amount. It's not that they want to be obese all the time. But when they know that there's going to be a period where there's not going to be food around, like when winter's coming, it seems to trigger a biologic switch where suddenly the animals will want to gain weight. They eat a lot more, they put on fat. And then when the winter hits, they're ready for it. They hibernate and they burn that fat, or they get enough fat so they know they can fly across the ocean without falling into the ocean in the halfway across from exhaustion. And so they actually have learned how to do this. And the way they do it is they trigger it usually by eating certain types of foods. And our work actually was kind of able to identify this switch and to figure out what triggered it. And what was the incredible thing, Trey, was that we realized that things like metabolic syndrome, which a quarter of our population has, where you get visceral obesity and your blood pressure goes up and you get fat in your liver and you get fat in your blood and you become insulin resistant, and all these things that we thought of was as a disease process. I was taught this was like pre-diabetes. It is pre-diabetes, and we thought of it as something like, it's bad, it's pathophysiologic, it's the beginning of a disease process, and it sort of is, but it's actually a desired process that these animals want. That is the switch, to store that fat and everything. And then the animals will survive off the fat when there's no food around. And the insulin resistance helps them by keeping the glucose in the blood high, because that makes sure that the brain gets enough glucose. And so this process is actually something of great value to animals when they're in trouble. And what we learned is that this is triggered by certain foods, and that animals are taught to search for these foods. They're foods that the animals like. And one of them is sugar. And guess what? So we're eating a lot of sugar and we're activating the switch, but we're not hibernating and we're not going on long distance migrations. And so the problem is that we're only doing half of the equation. We're doing the half to store the fat. We're not doing the other half, which is to burn the fat. Low carb diets, intermittent fasting is sort of an attempt to try to get back to the natural process. But so that was really what the discovery was. And then the surprise was that there's an actual pathway that does it. And when we figured that out, it turned out that it was a carbohydrate that actually triggers this. It's not a fat or a protein. It's a specific carbohydrate called fructose.
So you have labeled this switch that you referenced a few times just now as the survival switch. And the problem for humans in modern times, as you just said, animals have the ability to turn that switch on when they're going into hibernation or migration or going into a survival state, and switch it off throughout that process where they're having to utilize that stored fat for energy. We in modern times just have ample access to the foods that turn that switch on and never really make the effort to turn the switch off either. But as far as when we initially acquired that switch, you say that there is an evolutionary basis to that, and it involves a couple of different magnificent events in human and world history. What exactly were those, and how did it create the survival switch for humans?
Yes. Okay. So it turned out, that fructose is the mechanism for activating the switch. And when you eat fructose, which is a sugar, right? It's the sugar in fruit, but it's also in honey, and it's also in table sugar. And you have to eat a fair amount of it to really activate the switch. You're not going to do it by eating a single fruit, but if you're drinking tons of fruit juice, you could do it. And if you're eating sugar, you're definitely going to do it. All right. So the fructose activates this switch, and it does it through a specific biochemical pathway. And it's sort of really cool because, our bodies are driven by energy. And when we eat food, we're making energy. But there's two kinds of energy, really. There's the energy that we have available to use immediately. And then there's the energy we store. And the energy we store that's fat. Fat is actually stored energy. Starch in plants is a stored energy. We call it glycogen in humans, but it's very similar to starch. But most of the energy that we store is fat. And then there's the usable energy that is right there to use right away. Is called ATP. And normally an animal will keep its ATP levels high. And you want to have a lot of energy to do everything you want to do. And the fat, the stored energy, will provide energy, will break down to make ATP when you need it. And so in a normal animal running around, it keeps its ATP levels high. If they drop for any reason, the stored fat gets broken down to generate the ATP. And so we always keep the engine full and the tank full, as we say. So, but what fructose does is it drops that ATP, even though there's a lot of stored fat. So it blocks the ability of the fat to break down to replace the ATP. And it takes that ATP down to like 3/4 full. So your tank doesn't have all the energy. It still has a fair amount, but when it's reduced, it signals to the animal that there's an energy problem. It's like, you're going to run out of gas eventually. So it's better start looking for a gas station. And so what happens is it triggers all these processes to try to eat more. But the energy, when you eat it, instead of being funneled to replace the ATP, it kind of gets funneled to the stored energy. So now the stored energy goes up and the ATP levels stay low, and eventually they come back up. But by the time that happens, you've eaten a lot more food than you need, and you've stored it as fat. And so it's sort of a brilliant system. And only fructose really does it of all the nutrients, but other foods can be converted to fructose. So you just asked me the question, why humans, did they have something happen to them that made them particularly sensitive to fructose? And the answer is yes. We are very, very sensitive to fructose. And it's because of at least two things that happened in our past. If you study science, you know that we carry a lot of genes, and these genes program different things. And in mice, you can knock out a gene. And the way we often find about the function of something is to take a mouse and knock out its gene. And when we do that, we can figure out what that gene's doing. And it's been known for a long time that humans actually have knocked out two genes. So we are, we call them knockout mice, when you do it to a mouse. But humans actually have knocked out two genes. And it turns out that they knocked out those genes because they happen to, when you do that, you amplify the ability of fructose to activate this switch and to become more fat. And the first one occurred 60 million years ago. And used to be that animals made, a lot of animals make vitamin C, but humans lost the ability to make vitamin C about 60 million years ago. And that was a time, it was an ancestor to humans. It wasn't really a human, but it was our ancestor. It occurred right around the time of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And there was a terrible period of time of starvation. The world got hit by an asteroid, believe it or not, and it caused this thing we call an impact winter, where the ash and everything went up into the atmosphere and just kind of darkened everything. And plants were dying and animals were dying and food was scarce. You would think, why would you lose the ability to make vitamin C? But it turns out that vitamin C is an antioxidant. And the way you store fat is you create oxidative stress to those little energy factories that make energy, called ATP, that make this ATP. And one of the ways that fructose makes us hungry is to drop that ATP level by creating oxidative stress to those mitochondria that make ATP. So that suppresses them from making that ATP, and that helps bring that ATP level down, which then activates the whole switch. So fructose actually causes oxidative stress, which it uses to stimulate fat. But vitamin C is an antioxidant, so it counters that. So if you lose vitamin C and you make less vitamin C, or you don't make any vitamin C, then that oxidative stress will be stronger because it will be countered by an antioxidant. So when the antioxidant levels go down, the oxidative stress is higher and you get more fat. So what we did is we took mice and we knocked out their vitamin C. So we made them like humans in terms of vitamin C. And then we put them on sugar, with or without different doses of vitamin C. They had to get a little bit or they would get the disease scurvy. So all the animals get a little bit of vitamin C, but some got a high dose and some got a low dose. And the ones that got the low dose got a lot fatter than the animals that got the high dose. And so we learned that when you lose vitamin C, you actually increase your risk for developing obesity. There's vitamin C in foods too, and so when you lose vitamin C, it isn't that your vitamin C levels go to zero, because you can get vitamin C from other foods, and including fruit. But it's interesting, like the fruit we eat has a lot of vitamin C, so it helps counter the effects of the fructose that's in the fruit. But as a fruit ripens, the vitamin C content goes down and the sugar content goes up. And that helps the animal who starts eating a lot of fruit to start gaining fat. But in humans, we like more tart fruit that's higher in vitamin C. And so we're not eating that kind of really lush, ripened fruit that's like that fell out of the tree and is actually, almost not rotting yet, but very sweet. We tend not to eat those kinds of fruit.
Yeah, think of overly ripe bananas or blueberries. And typically when you see those lists of the best for you foods and fruits, oftentimes it's those berries that aren't quite to that maximal point of ripeness just yet. And I think for reasons you just spelled out, it makes total sense. So interesting to learn that. Also interesting to learn that you ended up a fructose expert by accident with an interest in uric acid really serving as that gateway. What effect does fructose have on uric acid in humans, and why is this important for our understanding of fat storage?
Yeah, exactly. So Trey, I'm a very curious guy, and I just love research. And even though I started in the field of kidney disease, I just keep tracking where whenever I find something interesting, I'm willing to go into that area and leave where my comfort zone, and then learn about the new area and then continue into it. So the way I discovered, became interested in fructose began with some studies I was doing on uric acid. And I was really interested in what caused high blood pressure. And, the high blood pressure has been thought to be involved the kidney. And it's one of the classic thinkings is that it's due to an impairment in our ability to excrete salt. And there was this very strong relationship with uric acid and high blood pressure. And when uric acid levels are high in people, the risk for high blood pressure goes way up. And then when we raised uric acid in animals, they developed high blood pressure. And we go, oh my God, could uric acid be involved? And we found that uric acid caused changes to the kidney that affected its ability to excrete salt. And we could actually tie the whole thing together. And as we were doing this, it was kind of like a big discovery that uric acid might have a role in high blood pressure. We found that other things could cause high blood pressure too, and they were all working through the kidney. But uric acid was right at the top of the list as being very important. Well, in people, uric acid is when it's high, we usually think of the disease gout, which is this type of arthritis that a lot of people get when their uric acid levels go high. And uric and gout is really associated with high blood pressure and obesity and metabolic syndrome and all these things. Actually, 80% of people with gout are obese or have metabolic syndrome, and 75% have high blood pressure. And it's basically I call it the poster child for metabolic syndrome. The two go together. And in fact, for a long time, some scientists thought that a high uric acid should be part of the definition for metabolic syndrome. In fact, the first people who studied it. So anyway, I was studying uric acid, and I was trying to, why is this thing so important? How is it working? And why is it high in people? And, the classic teaching is that it goes up with eating, with like drinking alcohol. And alcohol can raise uric acid, especially beer. And certain meats can, and gravies can. So there's a lot of people who talk about it, but there's actually a big association with sugar. And it was actually even Sir William Osler, who was the father of modern medicine, wrote in the 1890s that if you had gout, you better watch the amount of sugar you eat, and even fruit juices. And I mean, he put that in prominent. This is what you need to do. And people who have gout often will tell you that they have to avoid sugar because it can trigger an attack of gout. Well, it turns out that sugar, we mentioned, it contains fructose. And when you give fructose to animals, their uric acid levels go up, not just in the blood, but inside the cell. And the same is true as people. When you eat sugar, your uric acid goes up within 15 minutes. And so it's actually a cause. Fructose is a cause of raising uric acid. And fructose is also, sugar intake is actually a big predictor of high blood pressure. And we were actually able to give sugar to animals, and we gave fructose to humans. And when we gave high doses, they developed pretty significant increases in blood pressure that we could block by lowering uric acid. So we realized that, that uric acid was important in the blood pressure response. And then Taka Nakagawa, who's this Japanese fellow, a scientist, doctor who came to work with me, he said, let's give fructose to animals and lower the uric acid and prove that it really reducing their blood pressure. This was early on. And when he did it, he came back to me and says, hey, Rick, it did block the blood pressure, but it did some other things that like reduced the weight gain, it reduced the fat, increase in fat, it reduced the fatty liver. It didn't like cure it, it just reduced it. But the animals were still eating. We did studies where we had them eat the same amount of sugar, and it still did it. It was working independently of calories. And what's more is the uric acid was not in the caloric pathway. It wasn't supposed to do, lowering it. I could see it lowering blood pressure, but why would it have effects on obesity? So then at that point, I knew we had discovered something important, that sugar wasn't just causing obesity from calories, that there was an actual pathway. And that's what led us to this discovery that it was this drop in ATP. And I told you that the drop in ATP is driven by oxidative stress. And that's why vitamin C actually helps block that. But it turns out that the oxidative stress is triggered by the uric acid. And when the uric acid's inside the cell, it triggers an oxidative stress pathway that affects the ability of the mitochondria to produce ATP. So the uric acid turned out to be really important. And then what was really interesting is humans have higher uric acids than most animals. And this was due to a mutation as well. And this was a mutation that occurred like millions of years ago. And it occurred during a period of climate change and near starvation. And it was in a period called the Miocene epoch. And it was like 15 million years ago. And I found out that there was a period of time where 30% of all animals became extinct. And it was global cooling, not global warming then. And so I was outside my area of expertise, but I decided to meet up with world experts on that area. and I met up with a gentleman named Dr. Peter Andrews, who works out of the Museum of Natural History in London. And he's like the world expert on this period of time. And he and I together worked on this with others. We actually resurrected the extinct gene. We ended up doing all kinds of studies, and we basically proved that when we lost we lost the gene that made our uric acid levels higher. And when we did that, it was to help us survive during a period of food scarcity. And so it turns out that we've had 2 mutations that just barely kept us alive, but helped us survive really critical times in history when there wasn't much food around. And now we carry those mutations, and there's like 80,000 different food items in the average grocery store to pick from. And it's, we can eat sugar all year round. We can eat fruit all year round. We don't have that period where there's a food scarcity where we need to, where we won't have food for a month. And so we're continuously activating the switch. We have a heightened response to it, and bingo, that's really the formula for gaining weight.
Well, your research does such a great job of continuing to hammer your points home throughout this book. And as a matter of fact, there are obviously plenty of calorie in, calorie out ideologues out there. Those who believe that quantity matters so much more than quality when it comes to calories and weight gain. And to their credit, your research on rats that fed one group a lot of fructose and the other group no fructose over a short period of time found that the weight gain was negligible. But to the point that both things can be true and both things can matter, there were so many different other health markers in that research that showed that those rats were being set up for some serious health issues down the road, potentially even weight gain as a result of their, I say, diet choices. You guys are obviously making the choices for them, but because they were consuming so much more fructose than their counterparts.
Yeah, so let me clarify that just a little bit. So it turns out that the way fructose works, there's 2 ways. One is what it does independently of calories, and then one is that it does stimulate food intake. So it does stimulate increased food intake. So if I give fructose to an animal, the first week it will just eat its normal amount of food. But after the second week, it will become hungrier and the switch is activated. And at that point, the animal can't control its food intake, and it will eat more than it needs, and it will drop its energy metabolism. So it is eating more, and it gets fat because it's eating a lot more.
I guess to the point that I was trying to make, though, Rick, in a controlled setting where they literally didn't have a choice of eating more, because you're right about that. When you consume more fructose, you do ultimately want to eat more and end up consuming something for humans like 500 extra calories per day.
Yes.
In clinical settings. But when the caloric amounts stayed similar, even though those animals were hungry, they were kind of SOL there. They weren't able to eat.
You are 100% correct.
Right.
Yes. So if you don't allow them to eat more, they're hungry, but now they're eating, it's the same amount as the control animals. And so they don't gain very much weight. The weight gain is just very, very mild, because the weight gain is really driven by that extra calories, but they become sicker and they get fat in their liver. They become diabetic. Their blood pressure goes up. So all of those parts of the switch, insulin resistance, they are not dependent on you gaining weight. In fact, we did one study where we calorically restricted animals, but we still made them diabetic. They ate a high sugar diet. So exactly right. The one thing I will say about the energy balance people, the people who say that it's all calories, is that they do have one really interesting point, and that is that weight gain is really facilitated by eating extra calories. And fat, for example, has 9 calories per gram. So that when you eat French fries, the fat is really or anything fried, you're getting a lot of calories. Now, normally, if you just give fat to an animal, in many situations, it will not gain weight, because it controls so long as it regulates its weight, it'll just, it will control it. So if it won't eat extra calories, even if it's fat. But if you first give them sugar to make them lose their ability to control their weight, then when you give them fat, they really gain weight. And that's why, like, if you're on a low carb diet, you can eat a high fat diet. You know, low carb diets tend to be high in fat, and you don't gain weight because you control it. Your weight regulation is controlled. You're not hungry, and in fact, one of the great things about a low carb diet is people tend not to be hungry. They tend not to eat more. They don't have to calorically restrict. It's just natural. And so they can be given a high fat diet, but they're not really going to gain weight. But if you give them carbs so that you activate the switch, then when you give them high fat, they really gain weight. One of our really interesting findings was that it isn't just the fructose you eat. It's your body can make fructose from carbs. And that's how carbs mainly cause obesity, like potatoes and rice, and it's accelerated with salt. Salt really helps stimulate the conversion of glucose, which is in potatoes and starchy foods, to fructose. So glucose can be converted to fructose in the body. It's driven by salt, but it can also occur if you're just eating a lot of high glycemic carbs like rice and potatoes and bread. So basically, the way to think of it is that fructose can come from sugar and high fructose corn syrup. Major source, 15% of our diet are these sugars. So they're like the main, that's the hammer. Okay, boom. And then you can also make fructose from carbs, and especially what we call the high glycemic carbs, like rice, bread, potatoes, chips, some cereals. And so these foods that break down easily and release, where the glucose gets released, and we call them high glycemic carbs. And, you know, if you eat them, your blood glucose will go up a bit. And when the blood glucose gets up a little bit, that's when some of it gets converted to fructose. That's why French fries are so bad, because they got the salt, which they got the carbs, they got the starch, the potato. So that's bad. And then the salt accelerates conversion. And then the fat, you know, just added, expands the calories. So you can eat it really fast, and you're making all these, you're making fructose, and you're using the fat to gain weight. And so the French fries are bad. We knew they were bad, but they don't contain fructose. They just help you make fructose. So that was the other big discovery, was that the body can make fructose. And we even have data, Trey, that alcohol can make fructose. And I've been doing research on this, and others have confirmed it. But when you drink alcohol, the alcohol sort of acts like salt, in the sense that it activates the conversion of glucose to fructose. The alcohol doesn't get converted to fructose, but like if you're at a bar and you have a drink and you're eating pretzels, it will help convert those pretzels into fructose in your body. What's really interesting is that if we block the effects of fructose in animals, then when we give alcohol to animals, we can block the development of liver disease. And so alcoholic liver disease is indirectly from this fructose, and according to our research. And even more interesting, if we block fructose metabolism using special ways in the animals, we can block alcoholism. And so I actually have research funding from the National Institute of Health to try to develop inhibitors of fructose metabolism as a new way to help people with alcoholism. Wow. And it's sort of a pretty cool area. It's been known for a long time that people who like alcohol often like sugar, and vice versa. And if you ever, like me, I'm a physician, and if I'm in the hospital and if I'm seeing patients who are in there with alcohol withdrawal or problems with alcohol, It's very, very common to go into the room and find soft drinks on their nightstand because it's just the natural desire to crave sugar if you don't have alcohol.
Well, you cited the physician and sugar expert Robert Lustig, who said sugar is like alcohol without the buzz. Great quote there. And I wanted to get back to salt for just a second because that was one of the more surprising things that I read in this book. Obviously, a certain amount of salt is good for us. So, where is that line where salt goes from good to bad? I mean, I know that you mentioned pairing it with certain things just accentuates its ability to turn on that survival switch, but is there typically an amount for men and women where it does go from a positive to a negative?
Yeah, so it's really a good point. I mean, everyone does need salt, right? And we are losing salt when we sweat. We lose salt in our urine. And so it's a balance. We want to be eating enough salt to keep the salt balance in our bodies at a normal level. And the way life works is our cells live in an environment of fluid. The blood is carrying fluids to our body. And even in the cells, between our cells, there's fluid. Inside our cells, there's fluid. 70% of our weight is water. And that it's not just water, it's a solution of water and salt. And over the millions of years, our bodies have learned how to, the function of our cells requires a certain concentration of salt. And so when you go to see the doctor, we'll measure your salt concentration. We call it serum sodium, serum potassium. But sodium is actually the main salt that's in our blood. It's the main salt, and it's we measure its concentration. The concentration normally is like 135 to 145 milliequivalents per liter. So we have this amount of salt. Now, if we get dehydrated and we lose water because we're vomiting or we have diarrhea or we're out sweating, what happens is the salt concentration becomes higher because we're losing water. And if we drink a lot of water, we can dilute that salt concentration down. And likewise, if we lose salt, we can have the opposite effect. If we lose too much salt, the sodium concentration will go down. So our bodies really want to have the salt concentration at a very clear, a specific level. So when the salt concentration goes up, we become thirsty. We start drinking water, and so this is what is normal. So it turns out that animals are always trying to maintain a normal salt concentration, and but if they get in a setting where they get slightly dehydrated, they get thirsty. And what's interesting is when that means is their salt concentration goes up. And when the salt concentration goes up, it triggers the conversion of glucose to fructose. And the question, why would that be? But it turns out that when fructose activates the switch, it makes you not just hungry, but it makes you thirsty. So you're searching for water as you're thirsty. I don't know if you know, but when you drink a soft drink, it's usually you feel more thirsty than less thirsty.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the same reason. Anyway, so what happens is you also start making fat. And it turns out that fat can be a source of water, not just calories. I mean, it's sort of kind of amazing, but when you burn, fat doesn't contain water, but when you burn fat, you produce water. You make CO2 and you make water. So animals can use fat to help them provide water when there's no water around. So when that bird is migrating over the ocean and it's living off its fat, it's actually using the water it makes to help it as well. Whales, they don't actually drink seawater. They get their water mainly from the food they eat, but about a third of the water they get is from their fat. Animals in the desert use the fat, like some of them will have it in their tails or humps on their back, and they'll use that fat as a source of water when they need it. So when you get when you get really dehydrated, you convert that fat into water. If you're just very, very mildly dehydrated, not so bad that you're really dehydrated, but your serum sodium starts going up, you'll actually start making fat in preparation for dehydration. Well, guess what way you can make yourself mildly dehydrated? The easiest way is eat some salt, because it'll raise the salt concentration a little bit. It's not so dangerous that you are at risk of getting severely dehydrated, but it triggers thirst and it triggers the switch, and it's like preparing you. So what's the right amount of salt, which was your key question? So the National Academy of Medicine recommends about 4 to 5 grams of salt a day. And I think that's probably a good number. But what our data shows is that it isn't just the salt, it's the combination of salt and water. And everyone should be drinking water. And we're not drinking enough water. There's studies in people with obesity showing that they drink way too little. People who are overweight tend to eat high salt foods and to drink less water, and to show these subtle signs of dehydration. And we think that that is actually a major trigger for why people who are overweight gain fat and have trouble losing weight. And when we took animals and we just gave them sugar, but we supplemented them with water, we could reduce the degree of obesity. And so it's a balance of salt and water. If you're eating a lot of salt, drink even more water. And as soon as you're thirsty, you probably are activating the switch. So but having said that, there are certain situations where, I don't think anyone will get into trouble if you just drink 8 glasses a day. If you drink 8 glasses of water a day, 8 cups of water, 8-ounce cups, or 6 12-ounce glasses, that's a wonderful place to start. Now, if you have heart failure, or you're having surgery, or you're a marathon runner, they say to only drink to thirst, so if you get thirsty, just drink until the thirst goes away. But I would say that in general, most of us should be drinking 8 glasses a day, and we shouldn't be eating a lot of salt. If you eat like 10, 12, 15 grams of salt, then you're defeating the purpose. You're going to bring the salt concentration up. You're going to activate the switch. There's new studies coming out, Trey, where people have looked at this, quote, normal sodium range. So when you get a blood test done by your doctor, you can see your serum sodium. It's called Na. That's sodium. And it'll show the normal range. But actually, there's now data coming out to say that if you're in the upper end of normal, that you actually have a higher risk for obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, dementia, and mortality. So even within what we call the normal range, if you're in the upper end, it's probably not good. You probably want to be in the middle. The ideal serum sodium is probably 138 to 141, 138 to 142 maybe. And if you're like at 144 and we say it's normal, it's still carrying risk for you. And so we should all be drinking more water.
That's it for part 1 of my chat with Richard J. Johnson, MD, on his new book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, The Surprising Science Behind Why We Gain Weight and How We Can Prevent and Reverse It. Stay tuned. Next time, it'll be part 2 of 2 right here on Books on Pod.